I did more than that.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment. Today's hearing is on adaptation programs and policies as we prepare to deal with the inexorable, inevitable consequences of climate change. Nearly 20 years ago, Congress passed the Global Change Research Program Act of 1990, which requires the preparation of a national assessment of the consequences of climate variability and change. This assessment was designed to help us understand the impacts of climate change in the United States. A distinguished panel of experts completed that assessment in 2000. One of the lead authors, Dr. Tom Karl, is with us here today. On the front cover of the report were these prophetic words: humanity's influence on the global climate will grow in the coming century. Increasingly, there will be significant climate change related problems that will affect each one of us. We must begin now to consider our responses, as the actions taken today will affect the quality of life for us and for future generations. In the decades since that report was completed, global warming has not waited. It has accelerated. Climate change is occurring as we speak, and the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere will continue to warm the planet for decades. In the United States and the world, we must work together to successfully combat climate change. Mitigation, the act of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, will not be enough. Our country and other nations must also implement adaptation policies to respond to changes in our climate, in our ecosystems, and in our infrastructure. The many changes predicted in the national assessment are already happening, and they are happening faster than expected. An updated 2008 assessment of the 2007 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change documented many of these changes. According to the UN panel, North America has experienced locally severe economic damage, plus substantial ecosystem, social, and cultural disruption from recent weather-related extremes, including hurricanes, other severe storms, floods, droughts, heat waves, and wildfires. Whether it's the eroding coastal areas of Louisiana, Texas, or the Atlantic states, the floods in the Midwest, hurricanes in Florida, wildfires in California, or the loss of snowpack in the Pacific Northwest, I'm sure that every member of the subcommittee has their own story of how a changing climate has affected their area. North America is not the only continent facing adaptation challenges. Internationally, low-lying island states like the Maldives could literally go under as sea levels rise. As a result, the President of the Maldives is considering purchasing land to prevent his population from becoming, I quote, climate refugees living in tents for decades. In Africa, the UN panel projected that by 2020, 250 million people will be exposed to increased water stress due to climate change, and that yields from rain-fed agriculture could be reduced by up to 50%, severely compromising food production. This in turn could lead to significant national security issues for the United States. The UN panel also noted that if warming continues unabated, 30 to 40% of all the species on the planet will be at risk of extinction. If the climate change bill I introduced last year, I included provisions for a national climate service. A national climate service would create a central source of federal information on climate change, ranging from projections of additional sea level rise to mapping the nation's best sites for solar and wind power. This information will be vital in the years ahead and will reap tremendous long-term dividends. I look forward to hearing from NOAA to discuss their plans to implement this much-needed program. Adaptation alone cannot solve climate change. We can and must take actions to reduce emissions. Yet as we enter the warming world that we have now created for ourselves, we must recognize that we as humans have worldwide responsibilities for all of God's creatures, both human and animal, many of whom have little or no ability to adapt to climate change on their own. They will need our help, and we should be prepared to provide it as best we can. I hope that that will be our goal as we craft our ongoing adaptation policies. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony. I turn now to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you said, our hearing today is on climate change adaptation policies. In my view, as you know, cap and tax is a policy that requires adaptation. How will Americans adapt to losing their jobs? How do we adapt to increased energy costs? How do we adapt to a legislatively imposed economic recession? How does the nation adapt to losing its superpower status? Cap and tax isn't our only option. We can pursue policies that will both help the environment and the economy. And by design, a cap and tax can only hurt the economy while providing a questionable environmental benefit. It is indeed a scheme. Absent of global agreement that includes the heavy emitting developing countries, cap and tax will only send energy costs up while sending employment numbers down or someplace else. This year, the U.S. will reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. We will reduce them, and we'll do it without cap and tax. Emissions are way down in Michigan this year, but emission levels haven't even dropped to the 1990 levels, and folks are asking for 80% below those levels by the year 2050, perhaps. How do we get those reductions down so far? Unemployment in Michigan is already about 13%. 15% perhaps isn't too far away, with greater reductions in emissions. But in this debate over climate change, we've lost sight of our real goal. We've lost sight of what our policies should achieve. The focus has become a cap and tax as an end in itself. What about reducing global temperatures? As one who believes that climate change must be dealt with on a global scale, I've advocated a no-regrets policy that will achieve the same, if not better. Results as an arbitrary cap and tax scheme at a fraction of the cost. In fact, there are policy options available that would have a net economic and societal benefit while at the same time cutting emissions. We've lost too many jobs already. We shouldn't pursue options that will make matters worse. If we're going to pass climate change legislation, it should adhere to the following 5 principles. 1, provide a tangible environmental benefit to the American people. 2, advance technology and provide the opportunity for export. 3, protect American jobs. 4, strengthen U.S. energy security. And 5, require global participation. These principles deal with the issue of cost versus benefit, the cost of action as well as inaction. Cap and tax schemes simply don't meet that criteria. We don't need costly mandates if we invest in clean coal technology, remove the regulatory barriers to nuclear power, reward efficiency gains, and allow a technology to succeed in the marketplace. And we won't need the developing world to remain in the Stone Age if we want to export American technology. We don't need to lose millions of jobs if we help our energy-intensive industries and domestic auto manufacturers with their R&D investments. Climate change is a global problem, and it requires a global solution. And without joint international action, jobs and emissions will simply shift someplace else, overseas, to countries that require few, if any, environmental protections, harming the global environment as well as the United States economy. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell.
Thank you. And I commend you for holding this hearing. It is important. You are building a record which I hope will be very important as we go through the consideration of climate change legislation. Today's hearing is also on a matter that is important. The funds generated by an auction are already in great demand for all manner of things, some with great merit, some with rather less, and some with, quite frankly, none. As we have already seen in the President's budget, the funds generated from an auction are being counted on for budget purposes. I note that the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change noted, quote, observational evidence from all continents and most oceans shows that many natural systems are being affected by climate changes, particularly temperature increases. In the same report, we are warned that in the lifetime of a child born today, 20 to 30% of the world's plant and animal species will be on the brink of extinction if we don't take action now. I would note that the wildlands that we have a chance to save here are of immense value, not just to the future of society, but also to the purpose which we have, which is protecting us against climate change. So we must consider the value of marshes, mountains, forests, and ecosystems which can serve both as carbon sumps and also as opportunities for conservation in the traditional sense. A great conservationist, one that we all admire, the 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, taught us that conservation is also a great moral issue, that it is our duty as it ensures safety and continuity for this nation. So, Mr. Chairman, as we move forward, I remain committed to securing a dedicated fund for natural resource adaptation. I encourage the members of the subcommittee to look at Subtitle B of the Dingell-Boucher draft released last year, which has in it carefully crafted natural resource adaptation language that was written by my staff and the staff of the Natural Resources Committee. And it has the support of most, if not all, the conservation community. Similar actions are going to be taken by the Committee on Natural Resources. So I want to thank you for holding this hearing today, Mr. Chairman, and I hope that my colleagues will join me in saving some of the precious treasures that we can save using the resources and the finances generated by the auctions which will take place for the monies that we can produce for a very important cause. I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The right of free speech is a great right that we have in this country. Very few times we use it to espouse our theological or religious beliefs, but we do have members of the clergy here as members of the panel. So I want to start with Genesis 8, verse 21 and 22. Never again will I curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. I believe that's the infallible word of God, and that's the way it's going to be for his creation. The second verse comes from Matthew 24. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. The earth will end only when God declares it's time to be over. Man will not destroy this earth. This earth will not be destroyed by a flood. And I appreciate having panelists here who are men of faith, and we can get into the theological discourse of that position. But I do believe God's word is infallible, unchanging, perfect. Two other issues, Mr. Chairman. Today we have about 388 parts per million in the atmosphere. I think in the age of the dinosaurs, where we had most flora and fauna, we were probably at 4,000 parts per million. There is a theological debate that this is a carbon-starved planet, not too much carbon. And the cost of a cap and trade on the poor is now being discovered. These miners lost their jobs through the last, and Mr. Chairman, we talked about this job loss. I've got an IDNR report, Illinois Department of Natural Resources, that points to 4 mines that were closed specifically because of the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990. I'm going to share those with you later because we did have that discussion, and I do appreciate that. Appreciate the hearing. and I look forward to the questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for this hearing today. I'm eager to hear from today's witnesses about how our communities and our world can adapt to climate change. And adapt we must. California's Department of Water Resources projects that the Sierra Nevada snowpack will experience a 25 to 40% reduction by 2050. These are not empty numbers. They represent real impacts of climate change that translate into serious risk for my constituents. As California's climate warms, more of the Sierra Nevada's watersheds will contribute to peak storm runoff. High-frequency flood events are projected to increase as a result. We have no choice but to adapt to these changing realities. In Sacramento, we live by two beautiful rivers, the Sacramento and the American. As global warming intensifies, scientists predict greater storm intensity that could forever change these rivers' flow patterns. This means that my district will have to cope with more direct runoff and more flooding. California has not hid from these changes. Instead, we are leading the way in cutting greenhouse gas emissions. We are developing a comprehensive climate adaptation strategy. However, California and the entire United States will need additional resources to adapt to the realities of climate change. Water resource adaptation strategies will need to be coordinated between local, state, and federal leaders. And states with strained budgets and growing needs will require federal funding in order to adapt and protect our communities. That is why upcoming climate legislation must be bold and resourceful when it comes to adaptation policy. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing, and I look forward to today's testimony. I yield back the balance of my time.
We thank the gentlelady. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening today's hearing on this important topic. I believe it is imperative to look at the role of adaptation as we continue to discuss cap-and-trade legislation. Human beings are designed to be able to adapt to changing climate temperatures, and there are repeated examples in history of mankind being able to adapt when temperatures have fluctuated. However, adapting to drastic job losses and a failing economy due to burdensome cap-and-trade or massive bureaucratic regulations or a national energy tax scheme will be incredibly difficult for all Americans. A March 2009 National Public Radio survey said that Americans' top concern is the decline in the stock market and investment losses. The second highest concern is job losses. Every American realizes that we're in a time of economic trouble. So we must ask the question, is it prudent to pass a cap-and-trade bill which will increase the cost of energy and conceivably cause 3.75 million job losses? What's more, is it prudent to pass legislation that will make matters even worse by levying a new national energy tax that could cost families up to $3,100 per year? Mr. Chairman, we need to carefully consider the negative impact a cap-and-trade bill with a national energy tax will have on our economy. I do not believe it is in the best interest of American families to pass a bill that will make their way of life harder and more challenging. Instead, we should focus on investment in economic growth and direct actions to adapt to climate change as better alternatives. I look forward to hearing our witnesses today and yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate you calling this hearing on adaptation policies and programs. One of the things I'd like to say is I'd hope whatever this committee creates, cap and trade, that those dollars that are generated from it will be designated for the direct utility consumer assistance and not be used as a piggy bank for the U.S. government. We need to make sure that we deal with the policies that we really are trying to protect. While Congress continues to debate how to address future greenhouse gas emissions, many scientists believe we must learn to adapt to changes in the Earth's climate caused from emissions existing in the atmosphere today. Human beings have been adapting in our world for literally millions of years. Altered climate systems may have impacts on our environmental and economic well-being, and agencies at all levels of the government must be tasked with implementing adaptation policies to respond to real or potential climate change threats. This is not an easy task. Previous natural disasters in the U.S. have shown how woefully ill-prepared our nation is in responding to natural events. A hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico is not unusual. Whether it was Hurricane Katrina or Rita, or the most recent one is Hurricane Ike, that was the first hurricane to hit the Houston area that I represent for 25 years. Thousands of homes were destroyed, vast areas of our community were left for weeks without power, and many areas were short on essentials, food, ice, or water supplies. We must avoid the mistakes of the past and create more efficient and responsive federal recovery efforts for natural events. Coordinating climate research and monitoring across the federal government will be challenging, and I hope to learn more about NOAA's efforts to provide policymakers with the latest climate information and assessments. Perhaps most important will be preparing officials for decision-making and future planning based on unknown or unreliable factors. According to the National Research Council, the decision rules that assume a stationary climate are no longer valid. I hope we can create the tools and provide the resources necessary to assist officials in preparing for outside-the-box thinking to address these future conditions. State and local governments would also be provided assistance to perform local assessments and climate impact-related preparation efforts, such as updating floodplain maps and reinforcing levees and flood drainage systems. In addition, we must provide for those vulnerable to climate change, particularly low-income Americans with insufficient resources to prepare or adapt to the changing environmental conditions. And thank you again for the hearing, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Great. Thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. I think we've got a very varied and potentially very lively panel, and I'm sure it'll be very enlightening as well as very entertaining. Now, I'm not sure how the climate is going to change in the future or necessarily what effect our behaviors today are going to have on the planet, but one thing I do know is we need to do a better job ensuring that people are prepared for changes in the weather, changes in natural disasters. This is something we can address without necessarily taxing carbon or imposing a cap on carbon or establishing a trading platform where sophisticated investors can work up exotic carbon options and manipulate the market and make great sums of money. Now, next month in my district, I'll be hosting an emergency preparedness summit. I want to ensure that I'm providing the people in my district with information and resources that they need to survive and overcome changes in the environment. I don't have to tell my constituents because the weather in Texas is legendary. It changes constantly, and we have some of the most varied weather between hurricanes, tornadoes, hailstorms, snow, sleet, dust storms. We have some of the most varied climatological conditions on the planet. But taking the time to prepare and plan ahead does save money and it does save lives. And that leads me to the point of today's hearing. Preparing for any potential effects of climate change would be far less costly to the economy than mandating a carbon cap. And I've said it before in this committee that strong and growing economies are more likely to develop the technology and the breakthroughs that we need to spur the next wave in energy and innovation. Stifling the economy with carbon mandates may actually stifle our ability to solve this very problem. And yesterday in the Washington Post, the second editorial, I believe, dealt with just that issue, that it would be more straightforward and more honest of this committee to be talking about a carbon tax as opposed to cap and trade. I don't support a carbon tax. I think it's the wrong idea. But let's not hide behind this cloud of obfuscation with the cap and trade when really what we're going to do is tax energy, tax jobs, and tax carbon. I'll yield back.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Harman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Global warming needs a two-pronged approach. One, mitigation, and two, as we've been discussing this morning, adaptation. We are just beginning to understand that even if we implement an aggressive mitigation policy and significantly begin to reduce greenhouse gases, our nation and the world will still confront the impacts of global warming, including changes in weather patterns, deadly heat waves, and increasing infectious disease outbreaks. This is why any climate bill passed from this committee must address adaptation. California is already in the process of developing a statewide adaptation strategy because of its vulnerability to global warming. For example, my district includes a breathtaking part of the California coast, one of our nation's most beautiful natural resources. As a result of rising sea levels and increased storm intensity, we could lose the beaches. This not only affects the quality of life for me and my constituents, but will have a huge financial impact with the loss of tourism dollars. My district will also confront other California-wide impacts, such as a reduced water supply as salt water mixes with our freshwater sources, increased air pollution, and more days with temperatures over 100. The consequences of global warming will also lead to major national and global security concerns. And as someone who focuses on security, this is where I think we all need to focus. They include large-scale human migration due to resource scarcity, increased competition for food, water, and other resources, increased frequency and severity of disease outbreaks. The impact of climate change, such as desertification in the Horn of Africa, could lead to conflicts and push countries to the brink of collapse. This could strengthen terror groups that are already active in the region and could be a central breeding ground and safe haven for jihadists. That is why I'm pleased that we are studying climate change as a part of our national intelligence estimates, and I think it is absolutely critical, Mr. Chairman, to focus on adaptation here as one of the strategies that will hopefully keep our country and the world safer. I yield back.
Great. We thank the gentlelady. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an important hearing, and I appreciate the panel's participation today. It's the job of Congress to seek ways to promote our country's economic prosperity and to support policies that protect our country's national security interests. It is my opinion that a cap-and-trade energy tax does neither and runs contrary to where our focus should be in these tough economic times. The members of this subcommittee do not all agree on the causes of climate change, nor have all of the experts that have come before our group. While the debate on the causes of climate change have not been settled, what also has not been called into question is the fact that a cap-and-trade energy tax will cost this country millions of good jobs and will force the average American family to pay thousands of dollars in increased energy costs. President Obama's budget director, Peter Orszag, has even testified that energy taxes designed to decrease carbon emissions will be passed on to American families. According to Mr. Orszag, the average American household, the cost to them would be about $1,300 a year for a 15% cut in CO2 emissions. He admitted to Congress last year that the price increases borne by consumers are essential to the success of a cap-and-trade energy tax. If the idea is to promote clean energy, why do we continue to reject nuclear power as an alternative source of energy? Energy production and development in our country has come a long way over the past few decades. Instead of taxing American families and the small businesses that create wealth in this country, we should promote policies that encourage development of new, cleaner technologies. That's the direction and the course that we're currently on, and we should continue to travel that path instead of crippling our economy when we can least afford it. There are countless small businesses across America that are watching this subcommittee's action very closely to determine their future in our country. They employ millions of Americans and want to continue to invest here. But if we act irresponsibly, these firms will pack up and ship their investment and American jobs overseas. And to add insult to injury, many of the countries where these companies will relocate do not have the environmental standards that we already have today in America. These are important issues we need to discuss, and I look forward to hearing from the panel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. We thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Melanson.
I'd like to thank you for holding this hearing today, and I appreciate the conversations we've had and your decisions to try and look at all energy sources. I appreciate the ability of you to recognize that we need to explore all avenues. We are here today and to talk about the effect of climate change on the world around us, and I find it interesting that some people say it's a world problem now since we didn't participate in Kyoto. We should have been there at that point in time, so we wouldn't be discussing what do we need to be doing, which is different now. Even if this Congress enacted climate change legislation tomorrow, it'd be impossible to avoid the consequences related to the early effects of climate change. In fact, my district has felt the effects of warm ocean waters firsthand. 3 years ago, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita made landfall on the coast of Louisiana and leveled entire cities. Nearly 2,000 people lost their lives to those storms, and tens of thousands more lost everything else. The widespread devastation from the greatest natural disaster this country has ever seen is still evident today. Communities across the Gulf are facing rising tides, increased temperatures in the Gulf, which leads to stronger hurricanes, and in the case of Louisiana, the fastest sinking coastline in the country. Louisiana has lost over 1,900 square miles of land since the 1930s. That's more land than the entire state of Rhode Island. This country can't survive without coastal communities. These are the people that provide the seafood that we eat, the energy that drives our economy, and the labor that keeps our exports flowing to buyers around the world. Keeping our coastal communities alive ensures the health of the rest of the country, and to help these coastal communities preserve as the vibrant hubs of hard work and the culture that they are, we must all work together to find creative ways to adapt to the world that is always changing around us. Again, thank you for your interest and your help in this matter.
We thank the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to again commend you and Chairman Waxman for holding these series of hearings. They're very informational and informative, and most of the time they're even entertaining. So I'm grateful, as always, for this regular order. I especially want to thank Lord Monckton for testifying. He is generally acknowledged as one of the most knowledgeable, if not the most knowledgeable, experts from a skeptical point of view on this issue of climate change, and we're very glad that he could stay over this week in the United States and testify at this important hearing. Today's hearing is about adaptation. Adapting is a common natural way for people to adapt to their environment. I believe that the Earth's climate is changing, but I think it's changing for natural variation reasons. And I think mankind has been adopting or adapting to climate as long as man has walked the earth. When it rains, we find shelter. When it's hot, we get shade. When it's cold, we find a warm place to stay. Adaptation is a practical, affordable, utterly natural reflex response to nature when the planet is heating or cooling, as it always is, doing one or the other. As Lord Monckton will testify, in the Middle Ages, it was warmer almost everywhere in the world than it is today. Some of our ancestors grew grapes in Britain, others sailed ice-free seas to settle northern places like Newfoundland and Greenland. This period used to be known as the medieval warm period, was followed by the Little Ice Age, a period of dramatic cooling which lasted until the middle of the 19th century. During the Little Ice Age, both the Vikings and the British adapted to the cold by changing. I suppose that one possible adaptation response of Viking retrenchment and British expansion is that we're conducting the hearing today in English instead of Norwegian. In the Chesapeake Bay and the Piedmont Marsh of the lower Hudson Valley, layers of sediment reflect what happened to the North American continent. That history shows that the nature of the climate is to change and to make organic shifts in temperature regardless of mankind's presence or supposed influence. Nature doesn't seem to adjust to people as much as people seem to adjust to nature. I think that it's inevitable that humanity will adapt to global warming. I also believe the longer we postpone finding ways to do it successfully, the more expensive and unpalatable the adjustment will become. Adaptation to shifts in temperature is not that difficult. What will be difficult is the adaptation to rampant unemployment, enormous, spontaneous, and avoidable changes to our economy if we adopt such a reckless policy as cap and tax or cap and trade. That will devastate our economy, and we will have great difficulty adapting to that. The majority of this committee has promised, and I hope this is a promise they don't meet, to introduce an economy-wide cap and trade bill in the next month. No matter that the past 7 years have witnessed a cooling period, Europe just experienced its coldest winter in the last 20 years, last winter. In the name of a house of cards posing as scientific certainty and an alarmist policy asserted by its followers with a religious fervor, the Democratic majority apparently is hell-bent to propose to cap our economy and trade away our jobs. Some of us on this committee are going to try to stop that, or at least deflect it. On top of the very real threat of job losses caused by closed factories, shut down mines, vacant power plants rendered uncompetitive under an American cap-and-trade scheme, the new majority's cap-and-trade goal is to make our electricity so expensive, our gas so pricey, and our food so dear that we will be forced to change the way we live. We will literally be forced to change the American way of life. We have had hearing after hearing where armies of witnesses representing both sides of the debate have warned us of the impact of cap-and-trade on everybody in this country but the mega-rich. The people at greatest risk are low-income, middle-income families, blue-collar workers, the elderly, and those whose jobs will be destroyed, and I say will be, not may be, will be destroyed if we adopt a cap-and-tax policy. The question is not how Americans will adapt to cap-and-trade legislation. The question is if and how we will survive when blackouts, rampant job loss, and empty cupboards threaten our very way of life. With those cheery words, Mr. Chairman, I yield back and look forward to this hearing.
We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow. The gentleman's time will be reserved. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I woke up this morning and watched a little bit of the morning news, and the headlines were about a very unnatural adaptation that's going on in North Dakota. Apparently, hundreds of citizens spent the night last night filling over 1 million bags with sand as they're trying to race against time to keep the Red River within its banks. It's now twice its natural level, and of course our thoughts go out to them. Last year I witnessed firsthand the extreme rain and flooding and devastation that people in my district and across the upper Midwest experienced as a result of intense rainfall. We lost homes and businesses and farmland, not to mention millions of dollars of productivity. Wisconsinites also will not soon forget the severe winter storms that we shoveled our way out of a year ago. My hometown had more snow than had ever been recorded since such measurements began to be taken decades and decades ago, and in fact we beat the old existing record by 40% approximately. Many, including leading experts on climate change, fear that as a result of unabated increases in greenhouse gas emissions, this record rain and snowfall will become the norm. These events used to be called 100-year events or 500-year events, and we find them happening separated only by years or decades these days. And as the various regions across the country and the world experience sweeping changes in precipitation and weather patterns, not only is the environment at risk, but also food and water supplies, ecosystems, social structure, and national security. Fortunately, adaptation efforts are occurring to minimize both the costs and severity of climate change. In Wisconsin, local communities like Dane County are assessing lake levels to minimize property damage, funding wetland restoration efforts, and updating the hazardous mitigation plan, which identifies potential impacts of natural hazards. Smart planning is essential to ensuring that the most vulnerable regions and populations are protected. I expect our witnesses today will inform us about other adaptation practices taking place around the globe. Finally, let me state what I hope many here will agree with, that the impacts of climate change vary greatly from area to area. As such, to the extent that future auction proceeds are directed to support adaptation strategies, we must recognize that states and localities are best equipped to make decisions about how to effectively and efficiently invest in these practices. I hope we keep that in mind as we craft our bill, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and my good friend, Mr. Upton, for having this hearing. It's nice to have, as Mr. Barton mentioned, Lord Monckton here. He was a policy advisor to the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and so he's a very good witness for us to have, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Beisner from Florida, from Broward County. Dr. Beisner is a welcome witness here from my home state. We've gone through this whole idea of cap and trade here, and there's a mantra for global warming, and now there's a mantra for cap and trade. But if you said to yourself, is there any country in the world who's doing cap and trade? Well, there is. The European Union has put in place cap and trade. Phase 1 was tried, and now they're into Phase 2. As I understand it, they had to suspend the cap and trade commodity exchange because of very serious problems on ethics. And I think, Mr. Chairman, in all deference to you, I think we should also have a hearing on how cap and trade is working in the European Union, because if you have something that's actually being implemented somewhere, then it does not become theoretical. It becomes pragmatic and actual. And so at this point, we can theorize here, but the bottom line is let's see how it's working in Europe. Now, I can quote, obviously, statistics to show but the bottom line is that where are your statistics to show this enormous increase in jobs because of the greening or the cap and trade? So I think you have to show us that. We can show you statistics that we're going to lose jobs, we're going to increase taxes, but I think it's incumbent upon you folks, when you talk about all these new jobs from the greening of America, where are they coming from and what kinds of jobs are they? And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for convening this important hearing, and particularly to the 7 witnesses. Thank you for coming forward today. Mr. Chairman, the effects of climate change at times now seem distant compared to the pressing matters of restoring our economy, dealing with AIG bonuses and the like, and of course, attending to our budget. But ignoring this issue would be a terrible, terrible mistake. Regardless of our success in curbing greenhouse gas emissions, the global temperatures will continue to rise in the coming decades. Consequently, we face rising sea levels, increased tropical storm activity, more precipitation in wetter areas and less in drier areas, and increased spread and range of disease. This will affect communities domestically and abroad, and low-income communities will be at greatest risk. It would be my hope, Mr. Chairman, that in a cap-and-trade bill, to see regular funding generated from auction revenue dedicated to 2 to 3% each for both domestic and international adaptation efforts annually. Domestically, the Department of Interior and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers should administer these funds to deal with sea level rise and flood reduction and wise water use. Internationally, the U.S. Agency for International Development, as we call it, USAID, should administer the funds to promote ecosystem-based adaptation. Further, investments in deploying technology to developing countries, aiding farmers who face shifting weather patterns, and responding to increases in tropical-borne disease are imperative to confronting the coming problems rather than reacting to them. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for convening this hearing. I yield back the balance of my time.